16 jailed climate activists will today begin a legal battle against the length of their prison sentences.
The punishments handed down to members of Just Stop Oil range from 15 months to 5 years behind bars and includes those put in prison for their part in high-profile protests on the M25 and at the National Gallery. Broadcaster Chris Packham calls these sentences a direct theft of freedom and joins us now from the Court of Appeal in central London. Good morning to you, Chris Packham.
Morning.
All of these individuals were tried, convicted, legitimately handed down sentences within the sentencing guidelines. What is your objection?
My objection is that we have an overcrowded prison system, and here we have peaceful climate protesters being put in jail for unduly long sentences. Some of them have received sentences longer than those who commit violent offences or even sex offences. And we feel that they're being targeted and victimised when they have a legitimate right to non-violently, peacefully protest in this country, to draw attention to the fact that we are all exposed to climate breakdown, and it's the greatest danger of our age. And frankly, they're clamouring to get media attention to communicate this to an increasingly concerned public. Right. Today we hear that Rachel Reeves might announce the plans for a third runway at the same time as scientists have come out and said there was a 35% greater likelihood that the devastating fires in California were due to climate breakdown.
Chris,
so we feel that going forward we need to retain that democratic right to peacefully protest.
Right. Let's just for the time being stick to these sentences and these crimes that we're being punished with these sentences. I'm going to show a photograph here. You can't see it, so I'll describe it to you. This shows an ambulance trapped in gridlock on the M25 in one of these protests. Gridlock caused, of course, by Just Stop Oil, and it lasted for hours. Now, I put it to you directly that those protesters, such as Roger Hannam, could have had no idea what was going on inside that ambulance. There could have been a child in there or anybody in there that needed desperately to get to A&E, and they were stuck on the tarmac for hours. They could have died. Luckily, that didn't happen, but it might have done. Don't you accept that these specific protests, stopping the traffic on motorways, is playing Russian roulette with other people's lives?
Richard, the first thing I have to say, and you will know, that commuting around the UK now is extraordinarily difficult. Our infrastructure is jammed, and there will be, tragically, people stuck in ambulances, not through any fault of protest at all, at this very moment probably, and out throughout the course of the day. The protests that are set up by these people are there, and they liaise effectively with the emergency services to immediately get those vehicles through as quickly as possible. The other thing that I will say, and this is not a slight upon their right to protest, is recently we've seen exactly the same thing with a farmers' protest here in London. Ambulances stuck behind tractors. So let's just say that when people are protesting, and I believe they have the right to do so, they will, if responsible, do everything they can to minimise that type of impact. And I can put hand on heart and say that when it comes to the climate protesters, that is at the core of their mandate.
But hang on, just hold that thought a second. If somebody had died as a direct result of being held up on a motorway because of the gantry protest, if somebody had died, your response to their family would have been to say, well, traffic jams happen, could have been a traffic jam caused by an accident, could have been a traffic jam caused for any other reason. Sorry about that, but that's life. I mean, it's an extraordinary piece of logic.
Not really, Richard. My sympathies would be unbounded when it comes to anyone who had been affected by a tragedy like that, and you well know it. But let's look at the tragedy that's happening overseas that we've seen in California. Let's look at the magnitude of the calamity which is facing humanity. We are not talking about individuals in ambulances as an artefact of a protest. We are talking about billions of people whose lives are currently at risk because of the gravity of this problem. And if we are not being led properly by the media, if we cannot counter the misinformation on social media, we have a really significant problem. And what we do need to do is have the peaceful right to bring this to public attention so that the public fully understands the predicament that they are in.
You have every right, of course, to bring it to public attention. The point I'm trying to make to you is I'm suggesting to you that you don't have the right to play Russian roulette with other people's lives. Now, we're talking about life and death here, but, all right, let's move down the scale a little bit. and this is a matter of fact, Chris, and you will know this, there were children with special needs who missed crucial appointments because they were stuck in traffic.
And education.
And education.
No, sorry.
Sorry.
And medication.
And medication, I'm sorry.
Because in court, it was mentioned, as part of the evidence, a child with special needs on his way to school missed his medication, which placed the driver at risk because the child was at risk of being volatile. Then there was somebody suffering an aggressive form of cancer who missed an appointment at a cancer clinic and had to wait 2 months for a further appointment. And an HGV driver unable to deliver food worth £5,000 to a hospital. So, you know, if you even put aside the emergency services, you had a direct impact on people's health and well-being.
I don't seek to, you know, put the emergency services to one side. I'm here to acknowledge that all of these things are an inconvenience, and some of them, as you've highlighted, potentially a life-threatening and dangerous inconvenience. I'm asking you to think about scale. You've just seen what's happened in California. We've witnessed on your programme the flooding all over the world, which has taken people's lives, destroyed their homes and their livelihoods, and this is down to our predicament when it comes to climate.
Packham,
One thing I will say, Susanna...
OK. I was going to say, it's peaceful
Susanna,
protest is OK. Of course, everyone supports that right to peaceful protest. The point is you're standing outside courts. Criminal protest is not OK. The judge in the case of the person who was sentenced for the longest said, the plain fact is you have crossed the line from concerned campaigner to fanatic, appointing yourselves sole arbiters of what should be done about climate change. We still have to uphold the law, don't we?
OK. Yes, we do have to uphold the law, but let's look at that law, because since 2022, when the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act was brought in, that law has changed, and it's put really significant, you know, clamps on our ability to peacefully protest. We've seen people outside this court arrested for holding a sign with the writing, which is actually embellished on the wall inside. You know, we should have the right in this country for juries to acquit on the basis of their conscience. Some of these protesters were forbidden for telling the jury why they took the action they did. That was not allowed in court. Susanna, Richard, that's not democracy of any kind.
Well,
and one thing I will say, and this is about the media. Last year, Richard, I put 80,000, myself and the ENGOs put 80,000 people on the streets of London one day, and it got no media coverage because it was peaceful. Unfortunately, the media too is complicit into forcing these protesters to do, you know, stunts which will garner more attention.
You cannot possibly blame the media for what we're discussing here. But look, you talk about conscience and you talk about democracy. What is democratic about denying a family going to the funeral of their parents? Going to the funeral of their parents, who they've had as their loving parents for over 50 years, and they couldn't get there because they were stuck in a queue caused by Roger Hallam. They missed their own parents' funeral. Now, all right, that isn't a matter of, in the wider sense, life and death, but what a thing to have on your conscience. And what's democratic about that?
Richard, I was stuck in one of those queues on the M25 a few years ago, and I was stuck there because of a protest by Just Stop Oil. I was therefore forced to confront the situation. What was I doing there? Sweating in my EV, you know, because I was being held up. It was making me think about the gravity of the situation that we're in. And when you talk about democracy, do you honestly think it's fair that these people who are peaceful, non-violent, protesters, and we have a tradition in that country going back to the suffragettes, women vote in this country because of the types of protests that these people engage in. We have better rights for homosexuals. We have better rights when it comes to suppressing racism because people have had that peaceful right to protest. If we take that away, what I fear, Richard...
You can't keep introducing fresh elements. Let's deal with this. That family and others like them, this wasn't an isolated case, eventually slunk home after hours sitting on the tarmac, knowing that that funeral was taking place of their beloved parents. So they got home, and you're suggesting when they got home, they looked at each other and said, well, at least it's made us think about global warming. That's a good thing. Good night, everybody. Come on.
it's making everyone else think about global warming, and without the capacity to communicate that effectively, without the the constant assistance of the media telling people the truth and putting these things into perspective to counter the misinformation that's out there when it comes to climate breakdown, what else can we do? We put on peaceful protests, the media don't cover them. We don't get that. And when we do stand up to retain our democratic rights to peacefully and non-violently protest in a nation which has seen that drive positive changes throughout our history, then you're incarcerated for disproportionate amounts of time.
Okay.
5 years, you don't get that for some sex offences and violent offences. So I think that critically what this is about today is not climate breakdown, and tragically it's not about those events that you've described. This is about democracy in the UK.
OK, Chris Packham, thanks very much indeed. I think one thing that everyone can agree on is that there are sentences which are not tough enough for some of those very serious offences that Chris Packham mentioned there at the end of that interview.